Keanu Reeves returns to his old school in Toronto quietly, with no fanfare, just to revisit memories. But as he walks through the silent hallways, an unexpected sight makes him stop. He sees an elderly man, gray-haired, moving slowly as he scrubs the floor. Something about the way he holds the broom triggers a distant memory. It's him, the janitor from his youth. But why is he still here? A sense of unease stirs in Keanu. What he is about to uncover will change not only the old janitor's life, but his own as well. Before we continue the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The evening sky over Los Angeles burned in shades of amber and violet, the last remnants of daylight giving way to the soft glow of street lights. Keanu Reeves stepped out of his car, inhaling deeply as he took in the sight before him. His old high school, still standing, still carrying the echoes of voices from his past. He hadn't been here in years, decades even. The invitation had come in the form of a polite request, a fundraiser to support underprivileged students, a cause close to his heart. As he stepped onto the familiar pavement of the school's courtyard, memories flickered at the edges of his mind. The clang of lockers slamming, the rush of students running late to class, the muffled laughter from groups of friends huddled together. But then something caught his eye. A lone figure moving along the side corridor, slow, deliberate steps, a mop gliding across the floor, a bucket rolling softly over the tiles. Keanu stopped mid-step, his brows furrowing. That walk, that posture, even after all these years, he recognized it. His heart tightened. It couldn't be. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots making a soft thud against the concrete. As he got closer, the overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows over the tiled hallway. And then finally, the man turned. Keanu's breath caught, the same weathered face, the same kind eyes, now framed by deep lines of age. Mr. Alves. Keanu stepped closer, a mix of disbelief and nostalgia flooding his chest. Mr. Alves, the elderly janitor, lifted his head, his tired eyes squinting slightly as he focused on the voice. For a brief moment, there was no recognition, just a polite, professional acknowledgement. And then, as if a veil had been lifted, his expression shifted. Keanu. His voice was rough with age, but there was something else beneath it, something warm, something that spoke of a long-forgotten familiarity. Keanu let out a small, incredulous laugh. It's been a long time. Mr. Alves gave a slow nod, his gaze drifting over Keanu, as if seeing the past and the present at once. A very long time. There was a pause, thick with the weight of time. Keanu had always known Mr. Alves as a quiet presence in the school, a man who worked tirelessly but never sought attention, a man who watched over the students, but from a distance. And yet, as a boy, Keanu had felt it. The way Mr. Alves noticed things, the way he helped without being asked. Keanu had been just another kid in a sea of faces, but somehow, this man had always seen him. The memories came rushing back. 1980s, a teenage Keanu sat alone in the gym, staring at the floor, frustration boiling inside him. It had been a rough day. He had flunked a test. His coach had been on his case. Home life wasn't exactly easy. He had planned to sit there in silence until the halls emptied. But then, footsteps. A shadow fell over him, and a rough yet gentle voice spoke. Tough day. Keanu didn't look up. He just nodded. Mr. Alves didn't push. He just sat beside him, setting down the bucket he had been carrying. You know, people think I just clean floors. Keanu had glanced at him, puzzled. But I see everything. I see kids who think no one notices them. I see the ones who fight battles no one else knows about. There was a pause before he continued. You're not as invisible as you think, kid. Keanu had never forgotten those words. At the time, they hadn't meant much, but now, standing here decades later, he realized Mr. Alves had been watching out for him long before Keanu even knew how much he needed it. Keanu blinked back to the present. He studied the man before him. Time had carved deep lines into his face. His hair, once dark, was now completely white. His uniform was clean, but old, worn down by years of labor. His hands, rough and veined, gripped a handle with a quiet steadiness. But what struck Keanu the most wasn't the age. It was the exhaustion. Not just in his body, but in his eyes. How many years had he been doing this? How many late nights, early mornings? How many floors scrubbed? How many classrooms cleaned? And most importantly, why was he still here? Keanu cleared his throat, forcing a smile. I never expected to find you here. Mr. Alves chuckled, shaking his head. I never left. The words were said lightly, but Keanu caught something in his tone. He glanced at the mop bucket, the wet floor, the employee badge clipped to Mr. Alves' chest. The weight of the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was still working here. Keanu felt his stomach tighten. Mr. Alves, are you still working full-time? The old man hesitated before nodding. Work keeps me moving. You know how it is. Keanu narrowed his eyes. That wasn't an answer. That was a reflection. There was a hollow in the way Mr. Alves spoke, a hidden truth behind the casual smile. Keanu glanced at his posture again, the slight tremble in his fingers, the stiffness in his movements, the way he shifted his weight off one leg, as if trying to ease some unseen pain. This wasn't just a job. This was survival. Keanu felt a wave of unease crawl up his spine. An 80-year-old man shouldn't have to be here, still cleaning floors, still carrying the weight of the school on his shoulders. Keanu had seen it before, the way society let people like Mr. Alves fade into the background, forgotten, left to fend for themselves. And suddenly, he had to know the truth. Why are you still working here, Mr. Alves? A shadow crossed the old man's face. For the first time in their conversation, he hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. Keanu noticed something that unsettled him. Mr. Alves was hiding something. Keanu couldn't shake the unsettling feeling from the night before. Sitting in his home, he replayed the moment in his head. The weary smile, the hunched posture, the faded uniform. Mr. Alves had been working at the school for decades. But why? Why was an 80-year-old man still scrubbing floors? There was only one way to find out. The next morning, Keanu returned to the school. This time, without the cameras, without the event organizers. He walked straight to the maintenance area, where the janitor's office was tucked away. The door was slightly open. Inside, Mr. Alves sat at a small metal desk, carefully sewing a tear in his shirt. His hands were steady but slow, the signs of age evident in every careful movement. Keanu knocked softly. Mr. Alves? The old man looked up, surprised to see him again. Keanu? Back so soon? Keanu smiled, stepping inside. I had to come back. I couldn't stop thinking about you. Mr. Alves chuckled, shaking his head. No need to worry about an old janitor like me. But Keanu wasn't convinced. He sat across from him, watching as the elderly man finished stitching his shirt. Then he asked the question that had been weighing on his heart. Why are you still working here, Mr. Alves? A heavy silence filled the room. Mr. Alves sighed, setting the needle aside. Because I have no choice, son. Keanu leaned forward, listening intently. My pension isn't enough. I work my whole life, but the little I get each month barely covers rent and food. The cost of living went up, but my income stayed the same. Keanu felt his jaw tighten. And your family? Do you have anyone who can help? Mr. Alves shook his head. No family left. My wife passed away years ago. We never had kids. It's just me now. Keanu's chest ached. He could see it now, the exhaustion in Mr. Alves' body, the silent resignation in his voice. This man, who had dedicated his life to quietly helping others, had been left behind by the very system he had served for so long. But there was more. Mr. Alves rubbed his knee absent-mindedly, wincing slightly. Keanu noticed. Are you in pain? The janitor hesitated before nodding. It's my knee. Doctor says I need surgery, but I can't afford it. And if I stop working, I won't be able to pay my bills. So I keep going. Keanu clenched his fists. The injustice of it all hit him like a wave. This man had spent his life serving others, keeping the school clean, making sure students had a safe place to learn. And yet here he was, struggling just to survive. Keanu felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just sadness. It was anger. How was this fair? How was it possible that a man like Mr. Alves, who had given so much, had received so little in return? But alone wouldn't change anything. Keanu knew what he had to do. Keanu feels an overwhelming urge to act. But how can he help without making Mr. Alves feel like a charity case? Keanu Reeves lay on his couch, staring at the ceiling. The city outside his window pulsed with life, but his mind was trapped in a different time, a different place. Mr. Alves, the man had spent decades cleaning the same hallways, scrubbing the same floors. And now, at nearly 80 years old, he was still there, not because he wanted to be, but because he had to be. Keanu turned over, exhaling sharply. This wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Mr. Alves had been more than just a janitor. He had been a quiet guardian, someone who had watched over lost kids like him, someone who had offered kindness in the smallest ways, in ways that had mattered more than anyone realized. And now, when he should have been resting, when he should have been enjoying the years he had left, he was still fighting to survive. Keanu sat up, rubbing his hands together. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. But how could he help without making Mr. Alves feel like a charity case? By morning, Keanu had made up his mind. He needed more information. Pulling out his phone, he made a few calls. First, to an old friend in finance. "Tell me about retirement for school janitors," Keanu asked. The answer was exactly what he feared. Pensions were low, barely enough to cover the cost of living, especially in a city like Toronto. Many retired janitors couldn't afford rent, medical bills, or even daily necessities. Keanu's jaw tightened. Mr. Alves had spent his life in service to others, and in return, society had given him nothing. That wasn't going to happen on his watch. That night, Keanu sat at his desk, scribbling in a notebook. Throwing money at the problem wouldn't be enough. Donations fade. Charity makes headlines, then disappears. But real, lasting change, that's what mattered. His pen moved faster. What if he created something bigger than just a financial fix? What if Mr. Alves didn't just retire, but instead became something more? Keanu thought back to his school days, to the times when Mr. Alves had been more than just a janitor. He had noticed when kids were struggling. He had offered advice. He had been a mentor without even trying. And that's when it hit Keanu. The school didn't just need better wages for its workers. It needed Mr. Alves, his wisdom, a mentorship program where students could learn real-life lessons from a man who had spent decades quietly guiding them. Keanu underlined the words, life lessons with Mr. Alves. A mentorship program, not just a handout, a purpose. Keanu closed the notebook, exhaling. He had a plan, but the hardest part was still ahead. Mr. Alves was proud. He wouldn't accept help unless he felt he had earned it. So Keanu had to make him see this wasn't charity. This was a new beginning. Keanu had a plan, but would Mr. Alves accept it? Keanu Reeves walked through the school hallways once more, but this time he wasn't just visiting. This time he had a mission. His plan was set. Now he had to convince the one person who might resist it. "Mr. Alves," Keanu said, finding him in the janitor's closet, fixing an old broom. "Back again?" Mr. Alves asked, raising an eyebrow. "Told you I can't stay away," Keanu replied, leaning against the door frame. Mr. Alves chuckled, shaking his head. "What's really on your mind, kid?" Keanu took a deep breath. "You." Mr. Alves' hands paused. Keanu didn't waste time. "Your knee's not getting better, and you know it. You need surgery, and I'm going to take care of it." The old man frowned, shaking his head immediately. "I don't take handouts, Keanu." Keanu had expected this. He nodded, then played his trump card. "It's not a handout. It's a job requirement." Mr. Alves' brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Keanu pulled a folded paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "A mentorship program. You won't be a janitor anymore. You'll be a mentor, teaching students about life, about hard work, about resilience. But you can't do that limping around in pain. So the surgery, it's not charity. It's part of your new role." Silence. Mr. Alves stared at the paper, his fingers tracing the words, life lessons with Mr. Alves. A mentorship program. Keanu could see the battle happening in his mind. Mr. Alves didn't want to stop working because work gave him purpose. But this wasn't stopping. This was becoming something greater. Mr. Alves exhaled slowly. "And what if I say no?" Keanu shrugged, a playful grin on his face. Then I'll just keep coming back until you say yes. A pause. Then a chuckle. Mr. Alves shook his head, smirking. You always were a stubborn kid. Keanu smirked back. Learn from the best. Mr. Alves picked up the paper, reading it one more time. Then finally he sighed. Guess I don't have a choice, huh? Keanu grinned. Nope. Within weeks, Mr. Alves had his knee surgery. Keanu made sure he had the best doctors, the best care. And when Mr. Alves woke up, groggy from anesthesia, Keanu was there, arms crossed, smirking. Better heal fast, old man. The kids are waiting. Mr. Alves is recovering, and the program is coming together. But will the school fully accept Keanu's unconventional plan? Mr. Alves reached for the small bag beside his bed, pulling out an old, worn notebook. The leather cover was frayed, the pages yellowed. He held it in his hands for a moment, then passed it to Keanu. I found this a long time ago, back when you were a kid. You threw it away. Keanu frowned, flipping it open. His breath caught. It was his handwriting, page after page, filled with messy, rushed words. His thoughts, his fears, his uncertainties. Words he had forgotten. Words from a boy who had once felt lost. Keanu scanned the pages. I don't know if I belong anywhere. Sometimes it feels like I could disappear and no one would notice. I want to be someone, but I don't know how. His chest tightened. He had forgotten this version of himself. The version that doubted, that questioned his place in the world. But Mr. Alves hadn't forgotten. He had saved these words. Keanu swallowed hard, looking up at the old man. Why did you keep this? Mr. Alves' eyes were steady. Because I knew, even back then, that you were going to be someone great, and I wanted you to remember where you came from. Silence. A lump formed in Keanu's throat. All these years, he had thought he had made it alone. But he hadn't. Someone had seen him when he thought he was invisible. Someone had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. And now, all these years later, he was about to give that same belief to a new generation of kids. Keanu closed the notebook gently, running his hand over the worn leather. Thank you, he said quietly. Mr. Alves smiled, nodding. It was never just about cleaning floors, Keanu. It was always about looking out for kids like you. The words in the notebook had shaken Keanu. What did his younger self write that will change how he sees his own journey? Keanu sat alone in his apartment, the city lights flickering outside his window. The notebook lay open on his lap, filled with words from a boy who had once felt lost. His younger self had written about fear, doubt, loneliness, emotions he had buried long ago. But one passage stopped him cold. If I ever make it, if I ever become someone, I hope I remember what it was like to feel lost. I hope I never forget that sometimes all a person needs is for someone to believe in them. Keanu exhaled slowly. Mr. Alves had believed in him before he ever believed in himself. And now it was his turn. He flipped the notebook shut, determination settling in his chest. It was time to make sure no kid in the school ever felt invisible again. Weeks later, Keanu and Mr. Alves stood in front of a new building on the school campus. The sign above the door read, "The Alves Educational Center, a place for second chances." Mr. Alves stared at it, his hands gripping his cane tightly. "Keanu, you didn't have to do this." Keanu nudged him. "No arguments. It's already built." The old man exhaled, shaking his head. "You always were stubborn." Keanu smirked. "Learn from the best." Mr. Alves has a new purpose, but Keanu has one final surprise left for him, something the old man never saw coming. The airport was crowded, filled with the hum of conversations and the rolling of suitcases. But in one quiet corner near Gate 32, a moment that had been a lifetime in the making was unfolding. Mr. Alves stood beside his small, worn suitcase, gripping the handle tightly. His ticket was tucked neatly into his coat pocket. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about work. He wasn't thinking about mops, floors, or late-night shifts. He was thinking about his brother, the man he hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. Keanu stood beside him, hands in his pockets, watching the old man with a small smile. "You sure you're ready for this?" Mr. Alves chuckled. I spent my whole life making sure other people were okay. Maybe it's time I let someone take care of me for once. Keanu nodded. Your brother is going to be happy to see you. The old man swallowed, his voice quieter. I hope so. A silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Then, Mr. Alves turned to Keanu, his expression softer. You've done a lot for me, kid. But you know something. Keanu tilted his head. What's that? A small smile formed on Mr. Alves' lips. You were always a good kid. I just helped you see it. Keanu felt a lump in his throat. The final boarding call echoed through the airport. Mr. Alves gripped Keanu's shoulder briefly, then picked up his suitcase. See you around, kid. Keanu gave him a nod. See you around, old man. And with that, Mr. Alves disappeared through the gate, stepping into the next chapter of his life. As Keanu walked out of the airport, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the notebook, the one Mr. Alves had saved for over 40 years. He flipped to the last page, and there, in his own teenage handwriting, were the words, If I ever make it, I hope I never forget what it feels like to be lost. And if I can, I'll help someone else find their way. Keanu let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head, because now, he knew he had never really been alone. And because of Mr. Alves, neither would the next generation of kids who walked through that school.